So time to move on. And I want to get to what I think is by far one of the most interesting events in this week in trading history.
Okay. What is it, Patrick?
Well, it is the United East Indies Company, or known as the Dutch East Indies Company, and it was the first company to ever become a corporation. It was in 1602. By the way, check out this logo. It's the VOC is the acronym for it in Dutch. I like that. That's the first corporate logo ever.
I didn't realize it was the first company to be
First company
sure
ever. So let me just go through. I'll tell the story in a second. But here's some of the thing. First corporation, first IPO, first stock exchange. The first to colonize Cape Town. They're the ones that discovered New Zealand and New Holland, which was later renamed as Australia. Like and the largest corporation on inflation adjusted that ever existed.
Whoa, Australia was called New Holland?
New Holland when it was discovered.
I had no idea,
New
man.
Holland and New Zealand, and New Zealand stuck, and New Holland was renamed Australia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But this is a big deal, and I love this story. The more I researched it, the more I was fascinated by this. So let's kind of go through all of this, right? So it's the Dutch East India Company. It was March 20th, this week in history, in 1602. And so just to put that in perspective, you take where Napoleon was, and the Mississippi bubble and all of these, and you have to still go 200 years earlier. So those are like the midpoint. We're going to 1602. And there was a huge and fierce competition in Europe for trade, obviously, and mercantilism and all these different things. And the English formed a cartel, the English East India Company type of thing. That was more of a cartel. It wasn't a publicly traded corporation or anything. And at the same time, the Spanish took away the ports they took over Portugal, and they took away the major trading port in Lisbon away from the Dutch. And so the Dutch were getting squeezed on every end, and the merchants in Amsterdam basically got together, and rather than working independently, they all came together and they created what is the very first corporation that has ever come to existence. And all corporations Sweet. That we know today were originated from that. And more importantly, they created the shares. And the shares were traded, what became the very first stock exchange to ever exist.
Wow.
So not only was this the first corporation, but then the first IPO then, but it became the first stock exchange to trade that. And just some amazing stories. They obviously had their own military power. They were able to coin their own money. They even had the power to enslave people. It was like the craziest power corporation that existed. But what was crazy about this is at its peak, it had, on an inflation adjusted, a market capitalization of over $8 trillion, which makes it the largest corporation that ever existed still to this day.
That's more than Amazon.
More than Amazon and Apple combined at their peaks, times 4.
Holy smokes. Wow.
Like this is absolutely crazy. So what they were doing, they had to circumvent and they had to create their own trading routes into the East Indies, to India and everywhere else like this. And so in the process of doing so, they were the ones that from Turkey or wherever it was brought tulips back to Amsterdam. And it was 30 years later that on those very stock exchanges that the famous tulip bubbles. I don't want to get into tulip bubbles because I think that in itself is a whole story we've got to cover in This Week in History. But the origins of the tulip bubble all come from not only the East India Company, but the very exchanges and the stock exchange that came to existence there. Isn't this amazing?
So when we look Yeah, so when we look back at all these crazy IPOs and stuff, we can blame the Dutch East India Company as being the start of it all.
It is, but there's even cooler stories than this. I'm not even done here. So this Isaac Lemery was on that exchange the first person known to on record to be the first short seller to ever come into existence, and in his process of going short, he was first recorded investor to seriously consider corporate governance in 1609, just 7 years after this company was formed. He petitioned, created, it was the first form of shareholder activism that came into existence. He charged the BOC's board of directors for all of these accusations and petitioned for the liquidation of the VOC in accordance to standard business practice. Like this is all first stuff that ever happened. Everything we
He
know.
sounds like a real dick.
He does. but it's just amazing. So first short seller, first shareholder activism, all of this has originated from this. And the company basically went bankrupt in 1799 because of some problems. But what I wanted to just show, here's some pictures here. So they still have in the downtown the original headquarters of the VOC and the Dutch East India Company. And
really?
yeah, it's still there. And more importantly, when you go and to downtown, in the red light district of downtown,
Nice.
where back in 1800 they had to rip down the original exchange and they rebuilt it, the Bourse van Berlage or whatever they call it now. But now it's just a conference center that was rebuilt. But that's the location of the first exchange ever and of where the first shares were ever traded. Of the largest corporation that ever existed. So when all our degenerate listeners are back in Amsterdam the next time in the red light district, make sure you walk by there and enjoy that little piece of history.
Come on, our listeners are much too sophisticated and not at all degenerate enough to go to the red light district.
Well, everyone's a tourist. Everyone's a
Yeah,
tourist,
that's
right? But
There you go.
but isn't that a great story?
That's a great story, man. That is
Like,
awesome.
and you know what, that inspires me. We have to circle back. I got to find some sort of a date we can pin to a week for the tulip bubble. But we have to talk about this because now that we kind of created this kind of foundation, it's going to be a great story to talk about in our tales.
Sounds great. Well, thanks for sharing that with us.